a little higher there?
Yeah, I mean, there could be. I mean, at this point, I think the most important point about this is that Apple just does not, they do not guide up very often, right? I mean, you can count the number on one hand how many times in probably the last 3 or 4 years they guided higher. So I think the kind of how I've been playing Apple, especially from 480 and below, was to me that the fact they got it up was huge. So I mean, here's my numbers. My numbers are, I think there's a little wiggle room to the upside. I kind of think they're going to come in something at $8 or above, right? So and I think they're going to come in something above the 37 billion revenue number. So I think what was the rate? I think they guided to the high end of 37 to 35 billion. So they're basically guiding. They're not saying they're going to be above 37 billion. I also don't know. I don't think they knew. I think they knew the 5S was going to be strong. I don't think they knew they were going to sell 9 million phones in the first weekend. So I think that number was so good it probably surprised them.
Okay. Or one topic I think is interesting. A lot of people are focusing on with the iPhones is the spread between the 5S and the 5C. Now, pretty much all the media reports it looks like heavily slanted towards the more expensive 5S. Now, do you think that's correct? Do you think the 5S is the real driver here?
I do. In fact, so here's what was funny. And part of the reason I want to do this call, there was quite a bit of negativity for probably 2 weeks. We'd seen these reports where, oh, the 5C is not selling well, the 5S is outselling the 5C 2 or 3 to 1, and those reports were kind of being construed as negative. And I mean, there were days where Apple was trading, under 500 and being down 7 points, 8 points, 10 points. And what was funny about that is, I mean, I'd rather have the 5S sales be 5 to 1 over the 5C. Because the fact that the 5S is the home run product, it's the higher margin product, it's a product that everybody wants, and it's the product that really shows that Apple has not lost the innovation edge. So, I mean, the more 5S's they sell, incrementally, I think is a huge positive. By the way, I'm not so sure the 5C is going to be exactly a terrible seller. I think really, and you and I have talked about this in the past, all the 5C is in relation to prior releases is the fact that it's the old model now at a slightly lower price point that they can sell for anywhere from $0 to $99 with the contract. So whether it was the 4S release and then they sold the 4 and the 3GS, I mean everybody kind of tried to say that Apple's doing something so different when in fact all they did is kind of put some colors and some cheaper materials on the iPhone 5. If anything, the sales of what used to be the iPhone 5, which are now the 5C, now actually also carry a higher margin. So that's a good thing, not a bad thing. But the 5S is definitely the driver, and the future driver will be the large screen iPhone.
Okay, thank you, Sean. I'd like to remind the audience, if you have any questions for Sean, feel free to put them in the chat. Okay, Sean, since you brought up this Apple sort of regaining the innovation edge, I'd like to get your thoughts on Samsung, because they reported earnings last week, and the last 2 quarters, they said their sales were really driven by high-end phones. And this time around, they said, no, it was more the mass market, low-priced phones. Do you think Samsung is kind of, wobbling on the edge? They've sort of been the leader, at least in terms of numbers. Do you think Apple's now taking that back?
Yeah, in fact, I'd written some pieces even before the 5S launch, which were showing that in the developed, what I call the discerning markets, Apple was no longer losing share. So basically, in all the developed markets, the discerning markets, and the markets where people wanting to buy a higher-end product just because of usability and whatnot, even the old iPhone 5 was actually gaining market share. So for the 2 quarters preceding the iPhone 5S, the iPhone 5 itself, which was a pretty old product at that time, was gaining market share in the U.S. and a host of other developed markets. Now, they were losing market share in China, but again, it's hard to verify the numbers. I'm not so sure they were losing market share in China, at the $600, $700 phone price point, right? So anyway, long story short, the 5S is going to be a market share home run. I wrote something like I called market share tsunami, or Apple set to take a massive increase in market share. I probably wrote that piece 3 or 4 months ago now, and that's exactly what's happening. So So there's sort of 3 points too. I mean, there's going to be a lot of noise around this quarter. The algos, who knows what the algos are going to do with the number. The whisper number, I think, on Apple is already at like somewhere between 805 and 810, if not higher, and all this kind of stuff. And I guess the 3 points I want to hit, and we can reiterate some of these before this call's over, but there's sort of 3 reasons I almost think not to sell or don't sell Apple until we see these 3 things. One isn't so much this quarter. I'm basically going to hold the majority of my, now again, if it spikes 20 or 30 or 50 points, am I going to trim some? Probably. But there's 3 things that have yet to happen. We do not have a firm China Mobile deal. We basically know it's going to happen, but it's not done yet. So until the ink is dry in the China Mobile deal, until we see actual iPhone sales, iPhone 5 sales in China, I still think that's a catalyst, and that's not a negative. The other key thing, I think the report that's going to be way more important than this coming report is the report following Christmas. So the January earnings report for Apple is going to be a big, big deal. By the way, I do think the new iPads are going to be a home run. In fact, I think the iPad refresh is going to be very, very similar to what this iPhone 5S refresh looks like. So I think the iPad refresh is going to be a big deal. I think Christmas season is going to be really strong. So I think Apple has a lot of upside up until they report in and through that January report. And then the last thing, I think the biggest catalyst of the coming 3 catalysts that I'm identifying here is I still think sales of large screen iPhone. So again, that part and parcel with my market share thesis is that once Apple is selling a 4.7 5-inch device, it's something dramatically bigger than the 5S is, it could literally be a market share swamp. We're already seeing a big market share take, but you could see a period where literally nobody wants to buy a large screen Android phone. And I'm saying nobody sort of facetiously, but let's just say that, let's just say Apple's lost, a good 15, 20 points of market share in the last 2 or 3 years to high-end Android phones. We could literally see that whole market share loss almost reverse. And those are the 3 catalysts. I think, in fact, it's funny to me. I still think analysts, even though analysts are pretty bullish on Apple, I think they underestimate sort of the sales power of a large screen iPhone. But those are the 3 points: China Mobile deal, not this report, but the Christmas season post-report in January, and large screen iPhone. Those are the 3 things that's going to materially keep me in the stock. And again, so that what is that? 2 to 3 more quarters from now.
Okay, I'm glad you brought up the new iPads, because that'll bring us into our discussion of guidance for next quarter. Now, a lot of people thought, specifically the iPad Mini with Retina display, which is $399. Now, do you think that's too expensive? A lot of people were saying, it's another $70 over the last one, and that one only went down $30 to $299. So are you worried at all that they're priced a little bit too high, and do you think there's any risk to guidance for next quarter because of that?
Well, there's always a little bit of risk to Apple guidance just because of how Apple guides, right? I mean, they typically do not, they're sort of the ultimate sandbaggers of all time, right? So we could be going into another period, though, where people sort of ignore the guidance out of Apple. The new man, Tim Cook and the new the CFO have sort of said that they're going to try they essentially said they're going to try not to sandbag as much as they used to. I think their formal comment was something like, you don't expect as much disparity between our actual results and our guidance in the future. I think they said that like 2 quarters ago. But they are the ultimate sandbagger on the guides. So there's always a little bit of risk whenever Apple does have a guidance coming up. But I really do. I think the iPads are going to be a big home run. I think the refresh, as I said, is going to be similar to the 5S refresh. I don't really think they have priced the products too high. I think demand is very good. I still see a lot of demand for actually the bigger iPad. And then other stuff I've looked at recently, I've been digging a lot into the enterprise market share. And I'd have thought by now that we might be seeing at least some erosion of enterprise market share of the iPad. The iPad initially had 90–95% market share 3 years ago when it was introduced. It's still like 85 to 90% of enterprise market share of tablets is iPad. And that, if you just think about that number, that's a pretty extraordinary number, given the fact that you can buy a pretty good Android tablet for $199, maybe $299 at the most. You're just not seeing the business user and the high-end user gravitating to mid-range or even a high-end Android device in favor of a Apple tablet that costs $200 to $300 more. So I really don't think it's a mistake because I don't think it's a mistake that Porsche doesn't try to sell a Porsche 911 for half the price. So the fact that Apple doesn't try to make a device and sell it for half the price, I just don't think it's a mistake. I think the Apple strategy of marketing to the high end has been pretty good.
Okay, now we are going. Thank you very much for that. We're going to get into some reader questions. So I'm going to combine a couple that have to do with activation numbers from the likes of Verizon and AT&T. Now, do you weigh, for example, Verizon's number, their activation number for the iPhone? It was light versus expectations. Do you weigh those numbers strongly relative to the numbers Apple itself puts out?
Well, 2 to 3 years ago, I used to. The problem with doing that today, in fact, there used to be an old ratio. You could basically take the Verizon and the AT&T numbers and sort of multiply them by a factor and get really close to total iPhone sales. The problem now is that Apple just has so many more international carriers, especially upon launch, than they used to. Those numbers probably just don't hold quite as good as they used to. The other big problem with Verizon is that Verizon was massive. In fact, I still think they're out. If you look at the gold one, the gray, I mean, pretty much any of the iPhone S's, they still have a long delivery lead time. So one of the single biggest reason I think the iPhone sales were a little light at Verizon was that Verizon had much longer wait times than AT&T. So for some reason, I don't know why this happened, but for some reason Verizon just didn't have as many iPhones, I don't think, delivered into its channel as AT&T did. And so on an AT&T side, it didn't look like the iPhone sales were light at all, whereas on the Verizon side it did. I think that had more to do with just shipments and delivery and the wait time for iPhone customers on the Verizon network. But yeah, no, I don't think that's a major issue, and I think you can't really use the old ratios anymore due to international shipments.
Okay, so let me insert unfortunately, I'm going to have to jump the line on the readers. I just went to Apple.com, and now I see that there is a 2 to 3 week wait time on the Black 5S, every single storage capacity, every carrier. Do you think these kinds of shortages are intentional as sort of, quasi-marketing and to help them look, hot? Do you think that's possible, or is that just urban legend?
Well, I mean, hey, I think they're doing everything they can to deliver product in a timely manner. I mean, there's been certainly a ton written about that. I have a hard time believing that Apple's just going to willingly give away or delay 5, 10, 20 million units in sales. So, I actually think Apple has done a ton of work for multiple years, really since the release of the second generation iPhone, to try to make sure that their supply chain builds these phones to their very, very exacting specs as fast as they can. But in fact, Apple's no longer doing, Foxconn is not making near the supply of Apple as they used to, and Apple is dual and triple sourcing way more than they ever have before. So I don't know. I guess I shouldn't say I don't know. I don't think that Apple is intentionally holding back demand. So no, I'm not kind of in that conspiracy camp that they're doing that.
Okay, we're getting a few questions on larger screen iPhones, and could you give your thoughts on a timetable and also the likelihood? And we might as well throw in, could there be a price war? Like, is that possible, or do you think Apple just sticks to the high end altogether?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely not going to be a price war of the large screen phones because they're going to come out with large screen phone. I think the price is going to be about the same as the 5S. Here, one thing that will be interesting is will Apple try to raise pricing even further and increase margin even further? I'm not so sure they will because I think by the time a large screen phone comes out, so let's sort of address this question in the pieces. So as far as timing, I think the absolute earliest would be the April quarter. That's probably as early as they can feasibly do it, given the supply constraints and building constraints that they have right now. But generally you look at kind of how Apple makes things, and by the time they produce stuff, by the time that the large screen phone comes out, they'll probably be able to hold to the same price as the iPhone 5S, and then secure other prices for other pieces so that their margin stays relatively the same. I do think that the large screen iPhone will be a slightly lower margin product than the iPhone 5S because it's going to be more expensive to make, and then the cost of build of materials is going to be a little bit higher. But again, I'd gladly take a slightly lower margin large screen iPhone because it'll just literally swamp everybody else. So as far as timing, again, I think earliest to be April. Probably more likely, I mean, that's probably 30% chance we see it in the April quarter. I think more than likely 60-70% chance it's in the June quarter and after. But yeah, I think it's going to be a big deal and going to be a huge catalyst. Was there any questions of yours that I didn't address?
No, but kind of to riff off that a little bit, do you think it's necessary for Apple to put out a larger screen iPhone because it looks like the competition, especially HTC, Motorola not doing so well, Samsung maybe slowing down a little bit. Do you think it's necessary for Apple to grow? I mean, let's say they don't come out with a big screen phone next year. Do you think that really affects anything one way or the other?
Yeah, I do. I mean, you just hit the key thing. You said, is it necessary that they do it to sort of maintain what they are? No, it's not necessary. But if Apple wants to resume, so become a renewed growth story again, I do think it's necessary. I mean, here's the other reason it is necessary. I mean, in effect, Apple has completely ceded a huge part of the market share to, I mean, put it this way. If they would have just said 2 years ago, oh, we're just going to start making a 4.5 to a 5-inch phone, and that's a great device, we'll make it, it'll basically be the same specs, but we'll just make a larger phone. I mean, what would Android market share look like today? I mean, it wouldn't exist in near the numbers that we see it today. So I do think it's necessary, and basically Apple has kind of willingly ceded a huge part of global smartphone sales to companies that are just willing to make a pretty good device with a large screen phone. I also think there's a pretty good part of the population that it's a good product for. I mean, I think a lot of older people don't see stuff as well. I think the large phones sell really well to older people that use smartphones. The Android phones do really well. I think a lot of younger folks too, because maybe of how their lifestyle is or income or the fact they don't have full-time jobs and things like this, or the money they get comes from parents and stuff. I think they're sort of more one-device type people. So I do think it's necessary for Apple to resume growth, but it's just such a home run. I mean, it's sort of like if they don't make a large screen phone, at some point that's going to weigh on results. And by the way, I mean, I've been critical. I mean, one of my thesis points in 2012 was that to buy Google over Apple when Apple was closed in on 700 and Google was 500, 550. And I talked about how fast Android share was growing. So it's not necessary for Apple to maintain $150 billion in cash and to be a great company and to be innovating in the core and software. But I do think it's necessary if we want Apple to break to new all-time highs again. I think we need a large screen phone.
Okay. All right. So the next question is, do you think Chromebooks, and why don't we throw in the recent Windows, the Microsoft Surface tablets? So do you think Chromebooks or Surface have any near-term impact on Apple?
Not really. Here's the Surface. So I wrote a lot about the Surface before I saw the price. I think Surface has made a huge mistake, and I do think Microsoft could have had a potentially, I don't know if it would have ever been a barn-burning great product, but I do think it could have been a moderately successful product, but they would have basically had to price the product at kind of a small loss leader, right? So, which basically I think they would have had to price the Surface at about half of what it currently sells for. So I mean, what a full-price Surface Pro is almost $1,000. I think they'd have to price that about $500. So a Surface with a pricing strategy that is way more correct for Microsoft, a loss leader type strategy where they try to, again, increase embedded base and sell some software into it, blah, blah, blah. I think a Surface product at half the price sells better. I don't think it would ultimately be a huge threat to Apple. I do think Chromebook, I mean, again, you can say whatever you want. I mean, I wrote 4 or 5 years ago I said Android tablets, the tablet share path would be somewhat similar to phones. And I wrote the Android phones would be 70% market share, and people laughed at me, and that's exactly what happened. I said Android tablet share was going to be 45 to 55% share. That's also exactly what's happened. So, but again, it's weird share. What I mean by that is it's share where only one company has really made any money, that's Samsung. It's share where, well, really only one company has made a ton of money, and that's Google. Everybody else is sort of making products in that price point and sort of suffered. So again, here's a funny way to think about this, though, if we kind of flip the thing and flip the equation. What if what all those people are now more interested in possibly buying an iPad? In other words, there's a price point out there. Maybe there's millions of people, hundreds of millions of people who just would have never paid $600, $700, $800 for an iPad. But they bought an Android tablet, and it was okay for $199. Well, 2 years down the road, 2 years later, now those people may have better jobs, they may have more income, they may have matured, whatever, and now if they want a better product that really works the way they want it to, that's going to last 4 or 5 years and have really good resale value, guess what? They can go buy an iPad. So maybe in the whole scheme of things, Apple's strategy really hasn't, I don't think the Apple iPad pricing strategy has been at fault at all. But again, I mean, there's going to be a place for this low-end market. We're clearly seeing it. It's going to, anytime you look at the market share numbers, the low-end products are part of that market share. But I don't think it's a big threat. Again, I hate to use the Porsche example too many times, but you know, Porsche's sales aren't really hurt by a Toyota Scion brand selling, you know, racy-looking, kind of cool-looking cars at $22,000 bucks. The buyer of generally the buyer of a high-end Apple iPad rarely is the same buyer of a high-end Samsung smart tablet. So, I mean, every now and then that buyer is the same person, but in many cases they're not.
Okay, why don't we pivot over to wearables, because we're getting a few questions on iWatch. Now, just today, Geek.com put out a report saying that the Samsung Galaxy Gear return rate is over 30%. Now, it's more of a trivia point, but are you counting on an iWatch or some other wearable in 2014?
I'm counting on iWatch, but I've written on this fairly extensively. I am counting on the fact that now that Apple, the A7 chip is so much better, the M7 chip, which is the motion detection chip, is really unparalleled. Apple's done a ton of innovation at the core. I do think Apple will help companies become absolutely dominant in medical device, medical monitoring products. And I would be very, very surprised if Apple doesn't integrate that into a wearable product that they make, whether be it glasses, be it a watch, be it some wearable type product. Here's the funny thing. Everybody's rushing smart watches to the market. And this is a case where, you know, Apple in the past has sort of come out with products a little quicker maybe than some other people. In this case, everybody's rushing out with products that nobody really wants to buy. My theory is that you won't really see much demand for a smartwatch until Apple makes one. And by the way, I don't want to sound like an Apple elitist, because that's not the case. And again, I made a very controversial call at the time to sell Apple and buy Google back in 2012. That was sort of some product issues, pricing issues, valuation issues. But I think it's just that the fact of the matter is they've got the technology, they've got the chip architecture, they've got the software and the ecosystem that I just don't know if the smartwatch category outside of Apple is going to be that big. I think, in other words, if you're somebody that's really into the Apple ecosystem, you'll probably like an Apple smartwatch. If you're somebody that's really into the Android ecosystem, I'm not so sure if you really want a smartwatch. So again, it's one of those markets, it's one of those products that Apple might be the only company that really ends up being that successful in it. Now, Google Glass, I think, is going to be I think that could be a huge product too. But notice that's a Google branded product. But I mean, all you have to do is look at the Samsung smartwatch to know it's probably not that great. I mean, I've looked at it. I would have no desire to have that. I'd have no desire to wear it. I think what we eventually see if Apple does make a smartwatch will be something not only that is very functional and useful, probably has medical device and monitoring technology embedded in it, but you know what? It's probably going to look really good, look really cool, and kind of become a fashion statement. And to have a wearable product be really successful, it's going to have to be a fashion accessory. if it's not viewed as a nice fashion accessory, it's not going to sell very well.
Okay, then that'll bring us to our final question. Since you're talking about fashion accessories, I did see outside of Google's, their building in New York City, I did see a guy once wearing Google glasses, and I thought they just looked kind of ridiculous. I mean, do you think that form factor is going to shrink or even be built into like standard eyeglasses or sunglasses?
Well, okay, so this is a really good, so here's like, what would an Apple iWatch look like that would be really great and really cool and everybody, so let's say an Apple iWatch actually looked like a Tag or a Rolex or some really, really nice looking brand watch right now, but then had maybe the screen flipped up and it had some smartwatch features and it integrated with your iOS ecosystem, right? So in other words, a smartwatch might actually look more like a nice looking watch that we know of today, but have really good embedded architecture. So you just hit the, so again, I'm not an eyeglass, fashionista. I mean, I like Ray-Bans, I like Maui Jim sunglasses and things like that, but you kind of just hit the nail on the head. I think my vision of what, if Apple gets into a glass wearable, it should be or could be a form factor where it ends up looking like what really good sunglasses look like today, or maybe it's even branded with one of those really good sunglass companies, and it just has embedded chip architecture and software in the device, and it links to your other Apple devices. So I really do think that for wearables to be ultimately successful, they're going to have to mix form and fashion. And my guess is Apple would probably be smart enough to partner with some of the existing companies that already dominate those fields, whereas other companies that are trying to do that are not necessarily doing the same thing. I would totally agree with you that Google glasses don't look very good, but the function is very, very cool. There's definitely a certain market that's going to appeal to them. We'll just have to wait and see what the eyeglass stuff looks like. But I think the stuff is going to have to look good, be very functional, because the thing is, the price point on those products are not going to be cheap.
Okay, Sean, thank you very much. And just to wrap up, so so can we say now that, let's say, over the next 6 months, you're still bullish on Apple?
Yeah, I'm very bullish on Apple. I'm still, in fact, I put a piece out that I could see the stock getting into the 800s. Now that's not a 6-month target. That's probably a 1 to a 2 year target. But I would be surprised if we don't see the stock getting back up into the the mid to high 600s within 4 to 6 quarters. Again, who knows exactly what's going to happen. I mean, I'm certainly not going to sell much Apple, if any. If any, I might take a hedge position into the quarter tonight. But again, the catalysts for me are weeks to months out. I still think Apple's very cheap. I think we could talk about Icon. We don't have enough time to talk about Icon. I don't know if that's actually the greatest influence on the stock right now. But the quick point is that the stock is not nearly as cheap as it was at 420. But relative to the market, it's as simple as this. You could make a case that Apple should sell at a market premium valuation to the S&P 500. It sells way, way below the price, the PE of the market right now. I think that is a ludicrous sort of valuation multiple that I think is going to get unwound over the next 2 to 4 quarters. So I think at a minimum, you're going to get Apple selling at the market valuation. At the higher end of my bull case, it might actually sell at a slight premium to the market. If that happens, my price targets will end up not looking ridiculous at all.
Okay, and since we have you on the line, why don't you give me one word to describe what you think about the Twitter IPO?
Awesome.
Okay, perfect. Sean, thank you very much. Everyone, thank you for joining us. If you'd like to get more from Sean, you can go to minyanville.com/TechStrat. And we will see you tomorrow after earnings. Stay tuned to Minyanville. We'll be covering everything. So thank you very much. And Sean, once again, thank you for your time.
Thanks, guys. Glad you could join.